I wish I could see more of you. You're pretty far back. There's an old educational adage that says that an ounce of knowledge is worth a pound of information, and an ounce of understanding is worth a pound of knowledge. But unfortunately, the educational system allocates about 90% of its time to conveying information, about 9% to conveying knowledge, and about 1% to conveying understanding. The explanation is simple enough. It's difficult for a teacher to convey what he doesn't have. Despite the overwhelming importance of understanding, we don't even understand what understanding is. And we didn't until a short while ago, as I'll try to explain to you. We tend to use understanding and knowledge interchangeably, and they're very different things. Information is what is contained in description. It answers to questions that begin with such words as who, when, where, what, how many. So somebody would say, how many people are in this auditorium? And you told them 114. That would be information because it's descriptive of the content of this room. How many can the auditorium hold? 900. That's descriptive information. Knowledge is contained in instruction. Answers to questions that begin with how to. So if I ask you where Washington is, and you say it's 30 miles to the north of here, that's descriptive and is information. If I say, how do I get there? And you instruct me to get there, you're conveying knowledge. Understanding is conveyed in explanation, which lies in the answers to questions that begin with the word why. Now, as I've indicated, we've only begun to understand something about understanding in recent years, because all of our understanding is rooted in certain very fundamental assumptions we make about the nature of the world and the reality which we experience. There are a set of fundamental beliefs that each of us has, which constitutes what's called our worldview, or what the Germans call a Weltanschauung, a concept of the nature of reality. And everything that we see, let alone think, is colored by that set of fundamental assumptions. That worldview has a significance which we've only recently begun to appreciate. It has two major impacts on the way we organize our experience. The first is the fact that you and I have a common view of the world is what makes us members of the same culture. A culture is a group of people who are bound together by a common view of the nature of the world. That view is usually inculcated in us through education, and we obtain it unconsciously. There are very few people who can articulate the view of the world which binds our culture together. We have to dig into our unconscious to extract it. But the significance is that when that view that binds a culture together begins to go through a change, society goes through a major transformation. It moves from what the historian calls one age into another. An age is a period of time in which a culture has a single view of the world. And when that view goes through a transformation, then the culture moves from one age out of another. Now, the significance of those definitions are that I want to make a thesis and try to defend it here with you this afternoon. And the thesis is that starting about the time of World War II, the Western world, as we know it, began to go through a change of age, a fundamental and profound transformation in our concept of the nature of reality, which, if we understand, enables us to understand the incredible rate of change that we're experiencing, the fundamental changes in our institutions, the changes in our morality, and all the rest of it, because it all derives out of a changing view of the world. Now, a period of transformation from one age to another is something that we all know, at least from our education. The one most familiar to us is the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a period of transformation from so-called Dark or Middle Ages into the modern era, which for reasons I'll make clear to you, I will call the Machine Age. There are aspects of medieval life that seem to have been lost in history. For example, what do you think the expected life was during the medieval period? Do you have any idea? It's 27 years old. 40% of the children born in medieval times never survived childhood. Over 95% of the people that lived in the middle period lived in abject poverty, a poverty at a level that we can't even begin to imagine. Over 95% of the people born in the medieval period never traveled more than 4 miles from their place of birth during their entire lives. They lived in small villages and never got outside of them, never had any exposure to any culture other than the one in which they were born and raised. Okay? Life was miserable. It wasn't all King Arthur's court. And therefore, the most common and widespread question of the era was, what's the purpose of life? What reason can there be behind this short period of abject misery? And the major institution of the day, the church, provided an answer. They said, life is preparatory for death. If you've lived your life right, you have an infinite sojourn in paradise, heaven. So why worry about a lousy 27 years? Focus on eternity. And that's what the Middle Ages did. They were preoccupied with death, not life. Portions of the church declared curiosity a sin. And man contemplated his soul and the spiritual life, not the objective life that he lived every day or the environment in which he lived it. If you look at the art of the medieval period, if you take literature, you think of Dante's Inferno, Milton's Paradise Lost. It all had to do with the afterlife. The graphic art of the cathedrals all had to do with angels and gods, very little with the everyday events of normal people. The music of the period was in support of the religious rituals, all of it dealing with spirituality. That orientation began to break down as a result of the Crusades. When Peter the Hermit led the first crusade across the face of Europe, for the first time, hordes of men and women were exposed to cultures other than their own. And they became curious about these differences and the roots of them. And out of that curiosity about differences in the way men lived grew the movement that we know as the New Humanism, and that gave rise to what later came to be known as the Renaissance. Do you know what Renaissance means literally? Rebirth. It was the re-entry of man into the world that he experiences, out of spirituality into reality. And with the growth of interest in the nature of man, there was a natural growth of the interest in the nature of the environment in which he lived. And so science as we know it today was born in the latter part of the Renaissance. And out of this orientation grew a new view of the world, which has pertained since the Renaissance all the way up through today, because an age doesn't end at a given date. Like generals, it tends to fade away as something else comes into the limelight. Let me characterize the age out of which we're just departing. And I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know. I'm going to try to raise it to consciousness and give it a structure so that you recognize it in a systematic way. There were two fundamental beliefs that were at the foundation of the view of the world that Western world had for 400 years. The first was a conviction that the universe could be completely understood, that man had the power through his mind to understand everything. Now that sounds a little arrogant today, perhaps, but there's still many people who believe it. As recently as about 100 years ago, in a major international conference of the leading scientists of the world, they went through a procedure that was common in the day. They issued a proclamation at the end of the conference, which was a statement of shared belief. And in approximately 1850, the leading scientists of the world proclaimed publicly to the world that it was their belief that by the year 1900, our understanding of the universe would be complete. It's a little shocking. Perhaps it's reassuring to know that scientists can't forecast any better than economists can. But the fact is they were completely wrong. They didn't anticipate any of the major changes which were to come, including Einstein and Heisenberg and so on. But the important thing is we believe that it was possible. Now, the second critical element of the foundation of the new era was the way we went about inquiring into nature and the nature of man. We developed a method of inquiry which became pervasive in the Western world. The method of inquiry is the one that comes naturally to us. If you observe any child in the process of learning, you'll observe the method of inquiry. If you give a child an object that he's never seen before, I'm not talking about an infant, I'm talking about a child. It could be a radio, a clock, a toy, or something like this. And he's never seen it before. What's the first thing he'll do to it if he wants to understand what it is? Take it apart, absolutely. We began inquiry by taking whatever it is that we want to understand apart. Second step was to then try to understand the behavior of the parts taken separately. And then once we understand the behavior of each of the parts, to aggregate the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. Three-step process. Take the thing you want to understand apart, try to understand the behavior of its parts, and then aggregate the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. That process is called analysis. Analysis became the mode of thought in the Western world, and still is the dominant one. It so dominates that if one person says, I had a problem and analyzed it, and the other one said, I had a problem and thought about it, and I asked you what the difference is, you'd be hard put to tell me, because we use them as synonymously. We didn't even entertain the possibility of there being another way of thinking. And so applying analysis to a world that we believed was completely understandable led to a series of questions, the answers to which formed doctrines, and those doctrines combined produced our view of the world. Let me show you how that happened. Suppose we take a familiar object like an automobile, and we want to understand what it is. We haven't seen one before. It says take it apart. Well, we take it apart, and over here we get a carburetor, this part here. And it says we have to understand the carburetor before we can understand the automobile. Well, how do you understand the carburetor? You've got to take it apart. Oh, now we got a valve out here, and you can't understand the carburetor until you understand the valve, and you can't understand the car until you understand the carburetor. How do you understand the valve? Take it apart. First fundamental question. Is there any end to the process of taking things apart? If you believe that the universe is capable of being completely understood, what must the answer to that question be? There has to be an end. Otherwise, you would never understand the universe. And therefore, the first fundamental doctrine, which is called reductionism, says that everything in the universe and every experience of anything in the universe is reducible to indivisible parts or elements. Everything in the universe is composed of indivisible parts or elements. Now, when I state that doctrine in that abstract form, some of you may not recognize it, but you all recognize it in its specific manifestations. For example, even in junior high school, you learn that every physical object in the world, if taken apart sufficiently, will ultimately reach an indivisible particle of matter called a what? Atom. The atomic theory is a reductionist theory of nature. It says everything in the universe consists of these indivisible particles of matter with only two properties, mass and energy. Though most of you were exposed to at least an elementary course in chemistry somewhere along the line, Now, I'll bet you in the first day of the course, the teacher handed you a table. You remember? What was it called? Periodic table, a table of the chemical elements. The ultimate forms of matter from which all other forms of matter are derived. In biology, you learn that every living thing ultimately reduces to a single element of life called the what? The cell. And you can go through every science and find that they were crusades, the holy grail of which was the element, which they searched for. Even in linguistics, they ultimately identified an element of sound out of which all language is built. It's called a phoneme. And so we believe that to understand anything, you must first understand the behavior of its parts and ultimately of the elements out of which it is composed. And if you look at the development of physics and chemistry, for example, it was essentially a search for understanding of the behavior of the atom, and in chemistry for the chemical elements, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and so on. That's the first doctrine. Now, once we've reduced an automobile to its atoms and understand the behavior of the atoms, we have to aggregate that understanding, and that means we have to know how those parts relate to each other. It's not surprising that in an era that believed that everything in the universe reduces to indivisible parts, that we also believe that every relationship in the universe reduces to one simple relationship, cause and effect. And science undertook a program of explaining the universe using nothing but this one relationship. Now, cause and effect is such a familiar concept that, again, most of us would have a lot of trouble trying to define it. So let me refresh your memory as to what it means. If I were to strike this lantern with this pen, you will hear a noise. I hope you heard it. If I ask you what caused the noise, you'd say my striking the lantern. Why? Well, a cause has to satisfy two conditions. The first is, if I had not struck the lantern, you wouldn't have heard that particular noise. In other words, a cause must be necessary for its effect. And if I did strike the lantern with a pen, it would make a noise. And that is that striking the lantern is therefore sufficient for its effect. So a cause is something which is both necessary and sufficient for its effect. Now, our commitment to cause and effect and to these fundamental doctrines of analysis and the understandability of the universe led to three fundamental beliefs about the nature of the world. The first one came about as follows. If I have something that I don't understand, I want to explain it, I must look for its cause. And I now have an explanation of the effect once I identify its cause. But what I have left over is an unexplained cause. Well, how do I explain the cause? Treat it as an effect and look for its cause. I'm still left with one unexplained cause. Question. If I were to take any causal chain and trace it back, is there any end to the process? Well, if you believe that the universe is completely understandable, what must the answer to that question be? Yes, there had to be a first cause. And the first cause was the creator of the universe. And we gave that cause a name, God. Our concept of God as the creator, the Father, derived directly out of our commitment to the concept of cause and effect. God is external to the universe, but responsible for it. Therefore, the notion of God as creator, which is characteristic of the Western world, but not for much of the rest of the world, can be explained by the fact that most of the rest of the world never made the commitment to cause and effect that we made. The second consequence of cause and effect thinking. Here's an effect that I want to explain. I look for its cause. Because the cause is sufficient for its effect, it provides a complete explanation. I don't need anything else to explain an effect. You ask me to explain the noise you heard when I struck the lantern, all I have to do is identify my having struck the lantern, and I have a complete explanation. That has an interesting consequence. It says the environment isn't required to explain anything. We developed an environment-free theory of explanation. Now that seems very striking in light of contemporary beliefs, but let me give you the evidence. I have frequently asked classes to identify the most familiar law of physics to them. I have usually some difficulty remembering the name, but most of them will say it's that law that Galileo got when he rolled balls down the inclined plane. And I have to remind them what the name of that law is. It's called the law of freely falling bodies. Some of you, the engineers in the group, I'm sure know it well. S is equal to 1/2 gt squared. The important thing about that law is the word freely in its name. Do any of you know why it's called the law of freely falling bodies? Why wasn't it called the law of falling bodies? Why is it freely falling bodies? It's a body falling in a vacuum. And then that raises the question, what's a vacuum? A vacuum is the absence of an environment. Every fundamental law of physics is a law which describes the behavior of things in the absence of an environment. Because we believe that understanding derives from knowing the relationships of things independently of the environment that they occupy. There's better evidence. What do you call a place a scientist does his research? Laboratory. What's a laboratory? It's a place deliberately constructed to exclude the environment. The whole purpose of a laboratory is to be able to study the effect of one variable on another without environmental intervention, because we believe that understanding comes out of knowing the relationship between things independently of their environment. The third consequence of cause and effect thinking derives out of the following question. Does every event that occurs have a cause? Well, if you believe the universe is completely understandable, what must the answer be? Yeah. Nothing happens by chance. Chance is a synonym for ignorance. It simply means we don't know enough to explain it. But everything is explainable except God, because God, being the first cause, cannot be explained and therefore must be accepted as faith, by faith. God cannot be known. You can believe it, but everything else can be known through the relationship of cause and effect. The doctrine that everything in the universe which occurs is the effect of a cause is called determinism. That gave rise to some problems we'll look at in a moment, to our concept of ourself as having free will. The apparent conflict between a view of the world which says that everything occurs is caused, and the cause determines the effect, and our belief in free will, that became the principal topic of Western philosophy for 400 years. And I'll come back to that concern in a moment. Now, Newton was the first one to pick up all these elements and put them together and look at it self-consciously as the elements of a view of the world. It's a world in which everything that exists and every experience is reducible to indivisible parts. These behave causal laws of nature, and they do nothing that is not caused. And therefore Newton developed the concept of the universe as a thing whose internal structure, if understood, and whose laws of change, if understood, were known, then the universe would be completely understood. Now, when he put that together, Newton told us what kind of a world it was. He said, the world is a machine, hence machine age. He did not say it was like a machine. He said it is a machine. Furthermore, he told us what kind of a machine it is. He said the universe is a hermetically sealed clock. And again, he didn't say it was like a hermetically sealed clock. He said it is a hermetically sealed clock. Clearly, it is the ultimate clock. It's the mechanism by which we tell time. Even the Navy has to rely on it. It's hermetically sealed. What's that mean? No environment. It's a closed system without being contained in an environment. The universe is self-contained. And so the view of the universe as a machine and everything within it as a part of a machine was the view that dominated Western culture for the last couple hundred years. With that view, certain derivative beliefs were critical. The first of which was a belief that was preached by every religion in the Western world, regardless of sectarian differences. That is, that the world is a machine created by God to do God's work. And therefore we are here to serve His purposes, to do His will, to fulfill His expectations. That's the purpose of life. You take that fundamental belief with one other that has even older roots. It goes back to Genesis. It asserts that man was created in the image of God. What's that mean? Well, that means that whoever wrote that believed that man is more like God than anything else on earth. Okay? That's not surprising, since it was a man that wrote it. If you believe that the universe is a machine created by God to do God's work, and man was created in the image of God, then the question arises, what should man be doing? What's the answer? Creating machines to do His work. And that was the origin of the Industrial Revolution. It was man's effort to imitate God as he understood Him at the time. As a result of this view of the world, every characteristic of the Industrial Revolution derives directly out of this set of doctrines. For example, we can't take a lot of time to look at it, but the first Industrial Revolution was about mechanization of work. Two fundamental concepts, work and a machine. What's work? Well, it took a major social revolution called the Reformation to tell us what work was. But one thing was clear, whatever disagreements there were about it, was that work was real. Now, reality reduces to atoms. And atoms have only two properties, mass and energy. And therefore, work was defined as the application of energy to matter. Here's matter. You apply energy to it in order to change the properties of matter. You change this matter into a different matter. If you apply heat to coal and convert it into a gas, that's work. You've transformed matter by the application of energy to it. If I move a chair, that's work. I've changed the location of matter. And so work was conceived of in purely physical terms. Now, what's a machine? Well, a machine is any object which can be used to apply energy to matter so as to transform it. Anything which I can use to change the properties of matter with by applying energy to it's a machine. See how good your memory is. Somewhere back in your 10th or 11th year, you learned that all the machines in the universe are reducible to 3 elementary machines. Because even the teachers in public school believe in reductionism. What were the 3 elementary machines, you remember? Wheel and axle, lever arm, and the inclined plane. And every machine in the universe is believed to be nothing but some combination of those elements. Reductionism again. Okay, there are the two concepts. Now, how do we go about mechanizing work? Well, the man that told us how to do it was Frederick Taylor, who wrote the Bible. He says you take a task to be done, and the first thing you do is analyze it. It's called work analysis by Taylor. And what's work analysis? It's a disaggregation of the job to be done into what Taylor called work elements. What's a work element? A work element is a task so simple it can only be done by one person at a time. For example, tightening a screw. Did you ever have two people try to tighten the same screw at the same time? It's hard to imagine. That's a work element. On the other hand, lifting a 500-pound table is not. But lifting a paper clip is a work element. Now, through work analysis, we attempted to divide work up into tasks that were elementary. The reason was that the simpler the task, the easier it would be to mechanize. We mechanized all we possibly could, but we couldn't mechanize them all. For one of two reasons, at least some of the tasks could not be mechanized. Either we didn't have the technology available for doing it, or although we had the technology available, it was more expensive than the use of human labor. And so for those tasks, we put people in to do them. And now we aggregated them. What happens, what do you get when you take work that's divided up into simple elements, each of which is performed either by a machine in person, aggregated into a sequence now which has a final product? What's that called? That's the modern factory, the production line or the assembly line. The composition and structure of a factory in today's world is a direct consequence of the application of the analytical method to a machine-age concept of work. And that raises some very fundamental questions. As you're going to see, there's another way of thinking than analysis. And that suggests the possibility that there are entirely different kinds of places to work than factories. And not only does it suggest it, they've already been built. I'll tell you something about them. You would not recognize them unless you're already familiar with them as a place of work. Because the concept that underlies them, the way that the work is organized and conceptualized, is entirely different. Now, I haven't told you anything you don't know. I told you I wouldn't. All I'm doing is raising the consciousness, things that have been inculcated in us in the process of growing up. What you may not know is what's been happening to all that in the last 25 to 30 years, because a great deal has been happening, but not conspicuously out on the front pages of newspapers. The only thing that's conspicuous is things like Toffler writes, who says that there's an accelerating rate of change, or that Drucker writes telling us we're in a period of discontinuity, or Nesbitt that tells us we're in the information or knowledge age. But why all of a sudden have these things occurred? What makes one age die and another get to be born? The answer is in a concept called a dilemma. A dilemma is a problem which cannot be solved within the prevailing view of the world, and therefore it constitutes a challenge to the view of the world. Now, starting way back, dilemmas began to appear out of the machine-age view of the world, but they didn't carry very much force until they gathered in number and momentum. And I'll give you some indication of when we began to recognize the significance of them taken collectively and began to suspect that something fundamental was occurring to the nature of our understanding of reality. The first dilemma which arose was the one I already referred to. How in the world do you explain freedom of choice of a human being in a universe in which every choice is determined by some cause? That's a neat one. Philosophers really did struggle with that for about 300 years, and they didn't reach a consensus until the beginning of this century. And the consensus which they reached is that free will or choice is an illusion which is granted to us by a merciful God who realizes how dull our life would be if we didn't have it. One philosopher who had a very rare gift, in fact he's the only one I know in the field that ever had this gift, expressed in 2 sentences what it took others 2 volumes to say. He said, "Man is like a fly riding on a trunk of an elephant who thinks he's steering it." He said the elephant doesn't mind, and it makes the ride more interesting. Now that didn't get rid of the dilemma, because all the argument in the world doesn't convince most people that they don't have freedom of will. But most people also believe that the world is a machine, and the machine cannot have parts that have choice. It's a contradiction. There was one dilemma. The first one that rocked the machine-age view of the world appeared in 1923 when a young German physicist, Werner Heisenberg, came out with something called the uncertainty principle. What Heisenberg was able to show is that if you take the 2 properties of an atom, its mass and its acceleration or momentum, and try to determine both of them at the same moment of time, then the more accurately you can determine either one, the less accurately you can determine the other. As the precision with which you determine one of those 2 properties goes up, the precision of the other must go down. Now that really did rock the world, because what fundamental belief of the machine age did he knock for a cocked hat? The belief that the universe can be completely understood. This says in the limit you can only understand 50% of it at any given moment of time. The greatest of American philosophers of the time, John Dewey, immediately responded by writing a book called The Quest for Certainty, in which he said, complete understandability of the universe is not attainable. It is an ideal which we can continually approach, but never in principle attain. And that was the first publicly recognized change in a fundamental belief of the era out of which we were coming. We gave up the belief in the complete understandability of the universe. In 1946, I returned from World War II to the university, and very shortly after I returned, early in 47, there was an event which rocked the academic world. A book appeared, which made an increasing number of people aware of the fact that something fundamental was up, but we didn't understand it, we weren't quite sure what it was. It was a book by the mathematician at MIT, Norbert Wiener, called Cybernetics. What Wiener and his colleagues, Frank and others, showed was this. They were taken by the new mechanisms created during the war, which controlled other mechanisms, servo mechanisms, they were called. Automatic pilots, guidance systems for missiles, and they tried to develop a theory to explain their behavior. And the startling conclusion which they reached was that whereas for 400 years, in our effort to understand the behavior of man, we took man to be nothing but a complicated machine, now we had a complicated machine which could only be understood if we looked at it as though it were a man. And they gave that machine a name. They called it a teleological mechanism. Teleological just means purposeful. It comes from the Greek. But you can't be purposeful without choice, and you can't be a mechanism if you've got choice. How can you have a teleological mechanism? You can't, apparently. And so, again, in Wiener's work, we became aware of the fact that the current view of the world simply wasn't holding up under the attack of science. But the final attack came in 1954 as a result of a book published by a German biologist. The content of the book was relatively unimportant, but the central and organizing concept of it became the key to our understanding of what the hell was going on. The author was Ludwig von Bertalanffy, and the book was called General Systems Theory. And it was the concept of a system which finally got us to understand what the nature of the transformation in our worldview was. Let me show you how that happened. In order to understand this, we have to understand what a system is. A system is a set of two or more elements that has three properties. I'm going to do a little abbreviating here. So the first thing to observe about a system is it's not an element. It has at least two, and therefore it can be taken apart. The first requirement is that each element in the set can affect the behavior of the whole. Each element can affect the behavior of the whole. Consider the most familiar system to most of us, ourselves. You are a biological system called an organism. You have parts like the heart, lungs, stomach, pancreas, and so on. Each one of those parts can affect your behavior. And we're aware of that. Except that somebody in the room is bound to be a wise guy or a wise gal and be saying to themselves, if not audibly, there's at least one part of the body that doesn't have any effect on anything. And that's right, there is. You know what it's called? What's the part of the body which, as far as we know, has no effect on anything? Oh, come on. Appendix, right. What does the word appendix mean? It means added on or attached to, but it is not a part of. And it's not a part of because it doesn't affect the whole. If the medical sciences ever find a use of the appendix, they'll have to change its name. Because then it won't be an appendix. Okay. Second characteristic of a system. The way each element affects the whole depends on at least one other element, what one other element or more are doing. I'm just going to abbreviate. So, for example, the effect which the heart has on your behavior depends on what the lungs are doing. If the brain stops functioning, it will affect what your pancreas, your liver, and almost everything else does. If the liver stops functioning, it affects the stomach, it affects the pancreas, and so on through the system. This is simply a way of saying that the parts of a system are interconnected. No part has an independent effect on the whole of which it's a part. The way it affects the whole depends on what other parts are doing. And the third and final characteristic of a system is if you take the elements that form a system and line them up in any order at all, and then subdivide them into groups any way at all, it doesn't matter how you form the groups of elements. Those groups of elements will have the first and second properties. Every group of elements can affect the behavior of the whole, and no group of elements has an independent effect on the whole. That doesn't sound very complicated, does it? We can summarize it simply and say a system is a whole that cannot be divided into independent parts. Well, what's so startling and surprising about that? Well, it wasn't obvious. That's why it took us several hundred years to find it. Consider two fundamental characteristics of a system which derive out of its nature. First, the essential properties of any system are properties of the whole which none of its parts have. What's the essential property of an automobile? What makes it an automobile? The fact that it can carry you from one place to another, right? What part of an automobile can carry you from one place to another? None can. Wheel can't. Seat can't. Not even the motor. Motor can't even carry itself from one place to another. The automobile can carry you from one place to another. I assume most of you are human beings. What are your essential properties? Well, you live, but no part of you does. You can read and write. No part of you can do those things. Your hand can't write. That's easy to demonstrate by removing it from your arm, putting it on a table, and watching. It won't do anything. It'll just sit there. Your eye can't see. You can see. Your brain can't even think. You can think. Okay? Those are properties of the whole, and they're the essential properties of the system. Therefore, when a system is disassembled, it loses all of its essential properties. If you take an automobile into a large garage and disassemble it, even though you've got every single part there, you no longer have an automobile. Because an automobile is not the sum of its parts, nor is any system. The behavior of a system is never equal to the sum of the behavior of its parts. It is the product of their interactions. The implications of that are so profound that we've only begun to understand them. Let me just point out a few for you. Our characteristic way of running any organization, military, governmental, corporate, or anything else, is to divide and conquer. It's even the way we teach people how to run them. You want to learn how to run a business, you go to business school. What's the first thing you got to do? Select courses, right? Well, what's a course? Well, you have to take a course in finance, a course in accounting, a course in production, a course in marketing. We've taken business apart. And then you study each part taken separately. And the fundamental assumption is that when you can make each part work effectively, you can make the whole work effectively, right? Wrong. Absolutely wrong. A system in which each part is working as efficiently as possible is a system which as a whole cannot be working as efficiently as possible. We can prove that rigorously, but we manage as though that were not the case. And we teach management as though it were not the case. You got a complicated task to do, you divide it up into pieces and make sure that each piece gets done as well as possible. Suppose we bought one each of every make of automobile available in the United States. There are 142 of them. And now I hire 100 of the best automotive engineers in the United States, bring them in, and say, look, here's one of every car available in the United States. Tell us which one's got the best carburetor. Well, that's the kind of thing they'd love to be paid to do. So off they go, and they come back a month or two later and say, the Mercedes has got the best carburetor. So we got a blackboard and we write down carburetor, Mercedes. Say, good, now take the transmission and do the same thing. They come back later and say, the Buick's got the best transmission. We write it up on the board. We say, let's take the distributor next. They do it. And one by one, we take every part required for an automobile until we find the best one available. Then we take that list and give it to the engineers and say, well, you take these parts off those cars and assemble them into the best possible automobile. Because we will now have all the best parts. What happens? Hell, we don't even get an automobile. Not only do we not get a good one, we don't even get an automobile. Why not? The parts don't fit. The performance of a system is the product of the interaction. It's the fitting that matters. But management is still focusing on managing the actions of parts rather than their interactions. The implications are incredible. We have 400 years of thinking of a manager as the pinnacle of an organization, telling the people under him what to do. Management as supervision or command. And that's absolute nonsense today for any number of reasons. The first is that when this doctrine was developed, the average educational level of a person working on a production line or in a military unit was 3 years. They were barely literate. The tasks which they were asked to do required virtually no skills. They were easily substituted for by another. Today we operate in a world where the average employee or member of the military has more than 12 years of education. They may still be barely literate, but they know a lot more, and they have skills which their bosses do not have. I've got programmers working for me that can program around me in circles. I can't tell them how to write a program. That would be nonsense. I've got mathematicians who can out-mathematics me to beat the band. My job isn't to tell them what to do. My job is to create an environment in which they can do what they know how to do as effectively as possible. It says that management is not about managing down, but managing over and up. Managing the interactions of the unit that you're responsible for with other units across and above, so as to enable those below you to do their jobs as efficiently as possible. Question: what happens if the guy doesn't know how to do his job? The answer is you got the wrong person in the job. The task isn't to tell them how to do it, but to get somebody who knows how to do it. You buy someone who can do the task. Second essential property of a system. When a part of a system is removed from the system of which it's a part, it loses its essential properties. Consider the hand. What's the essential properties of the hand? It can hold things, it can point, it can move in various ways, but the hand removed from the body can't do any of those things. The eye is an instrument for seeing, but it doesn't see when it's removed from the head. The brain doesn't think when it's removed from the head. They lose their essential properties when they're separated from the system of which they're a part. Now, let me show you the dilemma that broke the back of machine-age thinking. We have a system, any system. We want to understand it. Well, there's only one way of thinking about anything, let alone a system. It's to analyze it, right? Well, let's analyze the system. What's the first step? Take it apart. What happens when you take a system apart? You lose all of its essential properties. Second step of analysis. Try to understand each part taken separately. What happens to a part of a system when you separate it from the system of which it's a part? It loses all of its essential properties. In 1954, the aha experience of science was that analysis cannot yield understanding of a system. It yields something, but not understanding. It yields knowledge. And we needed a new way of thinking to be able to understand systems. The new way of thinking, which not surprisingly is called synthetic or systems thinking, is diametrically the opposite of analytical thinking. It does not replace it, it supplements it. We still must analyze systems if we want to know them, but they won't allow us to understand them. I'm going to show you why in a moment, but let me just give you a feeling for it. The British automobile has a steering wheel on the right. You all know that, don't you? Ours is on the left. Now, I will give you any number of American automobiles you want, and any number of British automobiles you want, and I'll let you take them apart from now to doomsday, but tell me why they have the steering wheel on different sides. You can't explain that by analysis. The original automobile was a 6-passenger vehicle, and it's only recently it's gotten smaller. Today, they're getting closer and closer to an average of 4. Why? I'll let you analyze old automobiles and new automobiles from the day of doomsday. You'll never be able to give me the answer to that why question. Do you know why the British have their steering wheel on the right? It's because knights were right-handed, and therefore they're able to defend their right side with a sword, but their left side was exposed. And therefore the inferior rode on their left to protect their weak side. The driver of the car is the knight, and the passenger is the inferior who drives on his left to protect him. The United States never had any knights in shining armor. We got about it for different reasons because we weren't using the right hand for that purpose. The car was originally built to carry 6 people because it was designed for the average American family, which was 5.6. It's getting smaller because the average American family is 3.2. Explanations never lie inside a system. They lie outside. Knowledge lies inside a system. Let me show you what I mean by taking an example. You got a man from Mars who comes down, and they're not very well educated up there. and he's never seen a university. And you take him to see one, and he says, "What's a university?" Now, if you're an analyst, how would you explain a university to him? You say, well, a university is an institution which consists of parts called colleges. But colleges have parts called departments. You see, you got to drive it down to the element before you can stop. Departments are driven down to the three elements of a university: faculty, students, and subject matter. Now you start there. You have to explain what a faculty member is. That's very difficult. But you make some kind of a stab as a person who presumably has knowledge of a subject matter that he is able to communicate to others. Boy, what a myth that is. A student is presumably somebody that doesn't have the knowledge that wants it. Equally a myth. The subject matter is what the one wants to get rid of and the other one wants. Now you put those together, you got a course. You put the courses together, you get a curriculum, you get a department, and so on, you build up. Have you explained the university? No. What you've done is you've revealed its structure. Analysis reveals the structure of a system, and it tells us how it works. We abbreviate that into know-how. Unless you're a psychologist, and you call know-how knowledge. Knowledge is the product of analysis. Understanding can't be. We needed a new way of thinking, and it wasn't until the middle 50s that we began to formulate it. As I said, it's exactly the opposite of analysis. So let's see what the opposite is. In the first step of analysis, you take the thing you want to understand and take it apart, right? What's the opposite of doing that? Take the thing that you want to understand as a part of a larger system. So the first step of synthetic thinking is to identify a containing whole, something of which the university is a part. For example, the educational system. Second step of analysis. You explain the behavior of the parts taken separately. What's the opposite of doing that? Explain the behavior of the containing whole. You now explain the behavior of the educational system. Instead of the parts, the whole. Third step of analysis. You aggregate the understanding of the parts into an understanding of the whole. Third step is synthesis. You disaggregate the understanding of the whole into the understanding of the part. Therefore, we explain a university by identifying its role or function in the larger system of which it is a part. Explanation has nothing to do with structure, but that's all analysis has to do with. And therefore, analysis yields knowledge, and synthetic thinking yields understanding. And there are two aspects of our quests for mastery over our environment. They're not separate. So look at what happened. Analysis went as the exclusive mode of thought in the 1950s. In the 1920s, our belief in the complete understandability of the universe went. What happened to all the other doctrines? Well, let's take a look. Remember reductionism? It came about because we said if I want to understand something, I've got to take it apart and then take the parts apart and so on. But now look what we got. We want to understand the university, we have to first understand the educational system. Well, how do you understand the educational system? Well, you're going to have to understand society, of which it's a part. How do you understand society? You have to go out to the world. This doctrine is called expansionism, but it appears to raise exactly the same question in reverse. Is there any end to that process? Now that's your midterm exam. Think about it for a moment. Is there any end to the process of expanding the containing system In other words, is there one whole which ultimately contains everything? How many of you believe that there is? Would you raise your hands just so you get a feeling of numbers? Come on, come on. Okay, there's not very many of them. How many of you believe that there isn't one whole that contains everything? Both sets are wrong. And it's important why. Remember, we've given up the belief that the universe can be completely understood, right? Suppose there were one whole that contained everything. Could you know it? No, because if you knew it, you would then understand the universe, but the universe is in principle not understandable. Therefore, you could never demonstrate that the universe does, in fact, consist of one whole. Suppose you believe that the universe doesn't have a containing whole. How would you ever prove it? It's an unprovable proposition, and therefore it's meaningless from the point of view of science. It turns out that question has no meaning in science once you give up the understandability of the universe. But it has a lot of meaning outside of science. Because when Arthur Eddington first gave this concept of the expanding universe, people felt a tremendous discomfort with that. There has to be some boundary somewhere, that contains everything. Psychologically, there's a need for identification of some containing whole. And that manifested itself in a very interesting way in this country. Somewhere about 1968, in the middle of the student revolution, I visited Berkeley, University of California in Berkeley. I was having lunch one day with a group of the faculty members and administrators, and at the luncheon table was the head of the university bookstore, which happens to be the largest university bookstore system in the country. And during lunch, he asked me an interesting question. He said, "Russ," he said, "what do you think is the heaviest selling book at the University of Pennsylvania, University of California bookstore?" I said, "The Bible." And he laughed. He said, "No, you're not even warm." He said, "Take another guess." I said, "All right, Rand and McNally's Road Maps." He said, "No." I took several more. The dictionary, no. I said, "Okay, I give up. Tell me." And he told me, and I never heard of the book. He said, "The I Ching." What the hell was the I Ching? Well, some of you know, I can tell by the expression on your faces. It's a book of principles which derives out of Buddhism. How come all of a sudden literature on Buddhism became the dominant literature consumed by university students at the University of California? Well, the first generation that was born after World War II reached the university. They were absorbing by osmosis some of the systemic transformation that was taking place. The concept of God the Creator did not match, for reasons you'll see in a moment, because we had to give up cause and effect. And therefore they were looking for a whole which contained everything that gave life meaning, as they put it. And they found it in the religions of the East. That is a very different God. That's not God the Father. It's not God the Mother. It's not God in it. It's God everything. It's a God that can't be pictured. It's not God the Creator. Are you the creator of your stomach and your lungs? Of course not. You are your stomach and your lungs. This was a God that was not your creator, but a whole of which you are a part. And meditation is the method by which you become conscious of your membership in that whole. And that's the religious experience, the awareness of the wholeness of what you are a part of. It's a very different concept. But it derives out of forsaking some of these concepts of the machine age. So reductionism got replaced by expansionism. And what happened to cause and effect? Well, there was a young man who graduated from Harvard in 1896. He was a screwball. Took his undergraduate degree in civil engineering, his master's degree in psychology, and his doctorate in philosophy. You can tell there's something wrong with him. He went to the University of Pennsylvania in his first job, and 2 years later wrote an article that was probably the most important article in science in the last 100 years, and practically nobody read it or had any understanding of what it was all about if they did. His name was Edgar Arthur Singer. He said science had been cheating for 200 to 300 years. And he went on to explain how and the consequences. He said, consider an acorn and an oak tree. Here's an oak tree, and we want to explain it, so we look for the acorn. He said, is the acorn the cause of an oak? He said, no, it isn't. He said, an acorn is necessary for an oak. You can't get an oak tree without an acorn. But it's not sufficient. It is insufficient. Why? Well, that's obvious. Take an acorn and throw it in the ocean, you don't get an oak tree. So it's not sufficient. I throw it in the Arctic ice cap, I don't get an oak tree. In the desert, I don't get an oak tree. Now, this was not Singer's discovery. Science was aware of that for a long time. But what science did, it said, this is a special kind of causality. And they gave it one of two names. It was called either probabilistic causality, which, by the way, was the foundation of a whole branch of physics called statistical mechanics, probabilistic causality, or non-deterministic causality. And that's what Singer said was cheating. How? If a cause is by definition something which is sufficient for its effect, what's the probability of the effect giving the cause? 1 and nothing else. And therefore, if it's anything but 1, it can't be causality. There is no such thing as probabilistic causality. If it's probabilistic, it's not causality. If it's causality, it's not probabilistic. The concept of determinism is implied by causality. If you believe that every event in the universe has a cause, in logic that implies determinism. Now somebody comes along and says, this is a logical symbol for not deterministic causality. That violates the most fundamental law of logic, formulated as early as Aristotle. If you deny the consequence, you must deny the premise. You cannot have non-deterministic causality. You can only have non-deterministic non-causality. Singer said this is a fundamentally different relationship. It's not a kind of cause and effect at all. And he gave it a name. He called this producer-product. The acorn is not the cause of the oak, it's the producer of it. And that's fundamentally different. Now, what Singer went on to do were some incredible things, and it would take us all day to even begin to appreciate them. But let me just try to give you a feeling for it by the use of a metaphor. How many of you ever traveled abroad and came across a fruit or a vegetable you've never seen before? Good, most of you have. All right, imagine a visitor from a foreign country who walks into your dining room one day, looks at a bowl of fruit on the table and points to one of them and says, my God, what's that? I've never seen it before. And you're shocked and surprised and you say, that's an orange. He says, what's an orange? You say, it's fruit. What do you do with it? We eat it. What's it like? He says. Say, wait a minute, I'll show you. Then you go to the kitchen, get a knife, cut the orange in half, and show it to him. And what you show him is a circular surface with a white seam down the middle and a segment of orange on either side. And just about at that point, your husband, wife, or whoever else shares your house with you comes in, and in characteristically annoying fashion says, what are you doing? And you say, he's never seen an orange, so I'm trying to show it to him. He said, what'd you cut it that way for? Why don't you cut it the other way? Or you're tempted to say, well, for God's sakes, what the hell difference does it make? Yeah? But if you reflect for a moment and say, well, maybe that will help. So we go take another orange, or put these two halves together and slice it the other way, and now show them something that looks like this. It's exactly the same orange, but are two entirely different views of it. Now, what Singer showed is that we had assumed that the universe is an orange that we can slice only one way, cause and effect. He says it's multidimensional. And there are an infinite number of relationships that we can use to slice the universe, and each one will give us a different view. And the more views of the universe we have, the more likely we are to understand its structure. Just as we're better able to understand an orange if we see both of these than if we see either one. So he said, this is cause and effect. I'm going to take producer product and see what the universe looks like using that one. Well, let's take a look, see what happens. Here's the oak tree out here now. We look for the acorn to explain it. When I have the acorn, since it's not sufficient, it's not a complete explanation. To explain the oak, I need to know what the other necessary conditions are. Well, what are some of them? Moisture, temperature, nutrients in the soil, all sorts of other things that you can name are also necessary. The set of all the other necessary conditions is called the what? The environment. Lo and behold, when you look at the universe through producer product, you need the environment to explain everything. When we looked at it through cause and effect, we didn't need it to explain anything. Exactly the opposite. You see, the universality of the laws in physics, contrary to popular belief, does not derive from the fact that they apply to every environment. It derives from the fact that they don't apply to any. They apply in the absence of an environment. The moment we make laws apply in an environment, the universality of laws disappears. I remember the terrible shock I had when the thing I believed in so strongly inculcated in me as a child. Everything that goes up must come down. How many of you learned that when you were children? Huh? Today we're putting things up all the time that don't come down anymore. Of course, every once in a while one that's not intended to come down does, but we know that that's no longer a universal law. In fact, what we know today is there is no law for which there doesn't exist some environment in which it does not hold. All explanation is environmentally relative, and therefore we have an environment-full theory of explanation instead of an environment-free one. First cause is gone. What happened to determinism? Perhaps Singer's greatest accomplishment was to demonstrate in detail how the concept of choice and free will can be incorporated into a view of the universe seen through the eyes of producer product, and choice becomes an objectively observable property of behavior, not something that's subjectively hidden in the dark recesses of the mind. And he created the test for determining whether you display choice, purpose, or free will. And this gave rise to the type of psychology subsequently known as behaviorism. And so each of the fundamental beliefs have undergone serious attack in the last 25 years. And a new view of the world has begun to emerge. It's a view of the world not as a machine, but as a system. But a machine is a system, so what's the difference? Well, that's the point. There are three kinds of systems. One is a machine. The characteristics of a machine are first that it has no purpose of its own. It's an instrument which is used by something external to it to serve that external thing's purposes. So when the universe is a machine, we had to have a God to give the universe a function. It was to serve his purposes, but it had no purposes of its own. An automobile has no purposes of its own. It serves the purposes of its owner or driver. It has a function, but not a purpose. Its parts have no purpose of their own. They are mechanical as well. And the ideal machine is one that is hermetically sealed one that will operate independently of its environment, that is environment-free. That's the lowest level of system, not the highest, because the next level of system is something we now call an organism. An organism has a purpose of its own, but its parts don't. You are an organism. What's the dominant purpose of any organism? Survival. And growth is essential for survival. So survival and growth are the fundamental objectives of any organism, the purpose of it. But its parts, organs, or cells have no purpose of their own, they have functions. And the environment is a passive supplier of resources like oxygen, food, and water, and receptacle of the waste and the product of the organism. And then there's the third type of system. See, notice that every machine is embedded in an organism, because a machine is simply a system that's used by one or more organisms. But there's still a higher level, and that's called the social system. The social system is a system that has purposes of its own. Its parts have purposes of their own, and it's part of a larger system which has purposes of its own. And consequently, the view of the world which emerges is of the universe as a purposeful system consisting of nested systems, each with its own purposes, with the possibility of incompatible purposes at any single level. And today we reconceptualize management as the balancing of the interests of the organization managed, the interests of the parts of the organization, because they have their own purposes, and the interests of the larger system of which the organization is a part. And awareness of the necessity for doing so hit us over the head after World War II. We had always known that the behavior of a system that contains people depends on the behavior of the people. That's no great discovery. But believe it or not, we didn't know until after World War II that the behavior of the people depends on what the system does to them. That's a feedback loop. And how do we find out? Well, it turned out that dissident members of organizations began to organize to protest what the organization was doing to them, how poorly it was serving their interests. And they threatened to obstruct or destroy the organization unless it better served their interests. This is the parts. These are workers who unionized and talked. We had the phenomenon of alienation from work. These are minorities who organized about the mistreatment they were receiving at the hands of a majority in Western societies. This is women who felt that they were being discriminated against by virtue of sex. The young who were discriminated against by virtue of age, the so-called generation gap. All of these problems are exactly the same in structure. The only thing they differ in is the criterion used for forming the group. But in each case, the group is a subset of the members of an organization who are protesting the way the organization affects their interests. That's come to be called a humanization problem. Simultaneously, after the war, individuals and groups outside the organization began to organize and protest the way the organization was affecting their interests. Two major such movements. The first was the consumerist movement, initiated by Nader, where people who received the product began to raise hell with organizations about what they were doing to them. And the second big one, of course, was the ecological or environmentalist movement. And so management had to begin to take into account the interests of the larger system and the smaller systems, as well as the systems which they managed. One other fundamental change, and then I'd like to throw it open for discussion with you. When we look at organizations as machines, they have no purpose of their own. They serve the purpose of their God. It's not surprising if you go back to the first literature on business and corporation companies, you will find that the theory that was employed was that a business is a machine created by its God to do his work. God was who? The owner. And believe me, in the 19th century, he had all the power of God in his company. He could employ who he wanted to under whatever conditions, compensate them in whatever way he wanted to. He could work you 66 hours a week, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. There was nothing which said he couldn't. He was present and all-powerful. What was the purpose of the corporation? The company didn't have any. It had a function. It was to serve the interests of the owner. And what was his interest? Profit. So the great high priest of mechanistic thinking of corporations is the eminent economist Milton Friedman, who in a recent article in the New York Times Sunday Magazine section used the following title: "The only legitimate of business is business," by which he meant there's only one appropriate objective for an organization. That's profit. Okay? That's a complete manifestation of thinking of the organization in mechanistic terms. Now, for reasons that we can't go into in any detail here, about the time of World War I, we had to give up that idea and start to think of companies not as machines but as organisms. Let me just mention one principal reason. The American economy grew so fast from the time the Industrial Revolution began in the middle of the last century in the United States, that had begun in Europe 100 years earlier, that by World War I, the growth that corporations could realize exceeded the growth they could realize if they reinvested all their profit into business. In other words, if the owner of a business took all the money he made and invested it back in the business, it still couldn't grow as fast as it was possible to grow. Therefore, the fundamental problem confronting American industry was, do I retain control of the corporation and restrain growth, or do I give up control and allow it to grow? Okay? How do you give up control to get growth? You go public. All our major corporations like Ford, General Motors, and so on were privately owned companies up until about the time of World War I. And then when they perceived the possibilities for continued growth that they couldn't finance, they issued stock. It's called equity financing. What happened to God? God disappeared, became an abstract spirit out there. The owners, the stockholders, 250,000 of them. You can't sit down and worship them or listen to their orders. How in the world do you handle that situation? Well, we had experience. 1987 years ago, God disappeared from the West. We had left us with a problem. How does the plain, ordinary mortal communicate with God? Well, we created an institution to enable him to do it. What do we call it? Church. We enabled the church to operate by creating a profession to run it called the clergy. It's exactly what we did in business. Peter Drucker explained it all to us very clearly. We created a church and a clergy. The clergy was called management. Operates exactly the way the clergy does. It represents the will of the owners to the laymen. How does it know the will of the owners? By revelation, the same way the clergy does. Has no more direct access to that will than the clergy does of God. Peter Drucker showed how the whole development of the concept of management in American industry after World War I simply followed path. But the whole language changed because now the organization was an organism. And it's reflected in everything we wrote about it. For example, the chief executive officer got to be referred to as the what of the organization. The head. Head is a biological concept. It's not a mechanistic concept. Machines don't have heads. Organisms do. The company, when it got public, got its name changed. It now was no longer a company, it was a corporation. What's the stem of the word corporation? Corpus. Corpus is a body. Legally, the corporation became a biological individual, as many of you know. In the court of law, the corporation has exactly the same status as the person does, because they are looked at as an organism. For complicated reasons, about the time of World War II, that concept of the corporation began to break down, and we began to think of it as a social system. Some of the reasons I've given you: the pressures from inside and the pressures from outside coming in on the organization. Now having to look at it there, and the question comes out, what's its legitimate objective? You see, when we move from thinking of a corporation as a machine to thinking of it as an organism, what happened to profit? Peter Drucker has an absolutely magnificent passage in which he says, profit is to a corporation what oxygen is to a human being, necessary for its survival, but not the reason for it. Profit was seen as a means, not the end, and the end is survival and growth. And so we entered the period of tremendous expansionism in American industry, where every company sought to be the biggest, the fastest growing, and the Fortune 500 emerged, and all those sorts of measures. Now we're reaching a new period where we're beginning to see systems, organizations as social systems, whether they're military, governmental, or corporate. Profitability, however interpreted, is not an appropriate objective. Survival and growth are not an appropriate objective. What is it? We have a word for it, but we haven't yet incorporated into our culture an understanding of it. The word is development. The appropriate objective of an organization conceptualized as a social system is development, not growth. Development and growth are two entirely different things. A cemetery grows, but it doesn't develop. A rubbish heap grows, it does not develop. Einstein was developing even when he was contracting in size, when he was ungrowing. Growth is an increase in size or number. But what's development? It's a very complicated concept. I'd like to share with you in a couple of minutes an experience I had in the Army, which taught me what development was. Not only taught me, it hit me over the head with it. I participated in the invasion of Leyte in World War II. I was part of the engineering department of 10th Corps headquarters, and my job was engineering reconnaissance. So I was traveling with the 1st Cavalry Division, looking for materials for building roads and other things on the island. And about 3 months into that campaign, I was on the western coast of Leyte. We were almost in the mop-up stages of that activity. And I had to call in the headquarters every day, which was on the west coast, east coast of the island in Tacloban, to get instructions for the day. And I phoned this morning, and they told me to come back immediately. Well, that was a nice idea, but I obviously want to know why. And they told me General Seibert wanted to see me. Well, I could only think of one possible explanation for that. I was going to be court-martialed again. That had happened. I was a sergeant at the time, so with a great deal of trepidation, I made my way back across the island. I got there that night, cleaned up, and the next morning, bright and early, went in to see General Seibert. He had a stack of papers on his desk. He said, "Sergeant," he said, "if these records are correct," he said, "you studied architecture, is that right?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Where'd you study it?" And I told him. He said, "Did you ever get a chance to practice it?" I said, "Yes, sir." "Where?" I told him. "What firm?" I told him. "Ever do any of it in the Army?" "Yes, sir." "What'd you do in the Army?" He took me through 30 minutes of this kind of questioning. The only thing that was clear is he wasn't about to court-martial me. Finally, he said, "Okay," he said, "I think you'll do." And I said, "For what?" He said, "The troops on this island are worn out. I want to build a recreation center in which men can spend 3 to 5 days, and I'd like to have somewhere between 400 and 600 men at a time be able to use this facility and take a rest." He said, "How would you like to design and build that facility?" Oh boy, that was really attractive. A lot more attractive than the 1st Cavalry Division up the other side of the island. So I said, "Fine." He said, good. He said, I want to show you the site I picked out. So we went out of his office, and he was right on the beach. We got a little LCI and came around the island. The island is kind of kidney bean shaped with a river running down it, and we were about here. We took this little craft and came around the island and down the river. The river is called the Borugo River, and at the head of the Borugo River there was a little town called Borugo. We came about a mile down into the river, stopped, and on the east bank there was one of the most beautiful plateaus I've ever seen. It was maybe 8 acres, beautiful flat ground, short grass, surrounded by trees, and right on the edge of the river. And the general showed this to me. He said, what do you think? I said, oh boy, it's marvelous, just great. He said, good, then you'll do it. And I said, yeah. So we got back on the LCI, went back up the island. He said, when can you start? And I said, when you tell me to. He said, tomorrow. I said, fine. He said, how many engineers are you going to give me? He looked at me and said, what are you talking about? He said, I can't spare any engineers. And I said, well, you don't expect me to build it myself. I didn't put it that way, but... oh, no, he said, I forgot to tell you. He said, I'm going to give you enough money to hire 250 natives. I said, I can't speak the language. It's all right, he said, I'm going to give you 2 interpreters. I said, okay, what materials will I have? He said, are you crazy? I don't have any material to spare for this thing. I said, what am I going to build it out of? He said, I thought you said you were an architect. He said, find out what the natives build out of. Build it out of that. I don't give a damn what you build it out of. Build it. Well, I didn't see how it could be done, but it was sure better to try than to go back. So the next morning, armed with 2 interpreters, I went to the town of Borugo, and I asked them, who's the best builder in town? They wanted to know why, and I said I would explain when I was confronted with the best builder. They confronted me with 2 young men who were brothers, who they said were the best builders in town. Now, you have to know what a building was like, lady, and I suspect some of you do. They lived in shacks about 10 by 12 feet, 1 room. They were up on stilts, and they were covered with grass and built out of bamboo and the trunks of coconut palm trees. This was really a primitive island. And I said to these 2 men, I'd like you to build a house for me. And they looked at me as though we were crazy, because they knew where we lived. We were living in pyramidal tents on the east side of the island, and we were a hell of a lot better than their shacks. He said, what do you want a house for? I said, I don't want a house. I want to see you build one. He said, what are you going to do with the house when it's done? I said, you could keep it. Well, they went to work for me right away. For 1 week, I followed them every hour of the day to see what they did. And I watched them build a house out of 3 materials. Grass, which is called nipa, it's a long grass, which they wove into maps around a bamboo pole, which they use for wall coverings and roofs. Bamboo, and the trunks of coconut palms, the only 3 materials they use. In the process of watching them do this, I developed a tremendous admiration for their skill, but also some of the deficiency of their structures became clear. All their buildings leaned. And I found out why. The grass expands in moisture. When humidity gets high, the grass, which they use to tie knots to put 2 pieces of bamboo together, loosens. And now you usually get moisture with wind. And so the building is pushed by the wind. It's relaxed because of the grass expanding, and so all the shacks lean. And I decided I didn't want a leaning recreation center. I needed a material that I could use to bind bamboo to bamboo that would not expand in moisture or be affected by heat. And it turned out it was laying all over the island. Signal core wire. It was all over the place. So we played with that a little bit and found out how to do it. The next problem I had was the river was absolutely pure, clean spring water. Absolutely marvelous place for swimming. At high tide, it was about a 1.5 foot jump from the edge of the land into the water. Perfect. At low tide, it was 9 feet and the water was 2 feet deep. That wasn't very good. So we had to build a dock that would carry 200 men and take them out into the water far enough so that they would not be too high and could get into an appropriate depth. The only thing to build anything that big with was the coconut palm, and that wouldn't float. It was too dense. So we had to solve that problem, and it finally occurred to us to build a cage out of bamboo and use empty 55-gallon drums in the cage, and that's what we did with about 75 of those drums. We were able to build a big cage that floated and went up and down on a pole with the tide and could carry 200 men. Now the point is that over the next 3 months, with 150 men who went out to collect the material and 100 women who wove the nipa, we built a recreation center that had locker rooms, indoor facilities, showers to accommodate 400 men. We had baseball diamonds, football diamonds, basketball courts, everything using only the 3 materials the natives used, plus 2 that were laying around that they could have used but didn't. But we did things they had never seen before. For example, the main recreation hall was 40 by 60 feet. When we put the walls up, the natives were screaming at me because we had a crowd every day watching what was going on. What they're screaming about is I wouldn't be able to put a roof on that building. Why the hell did I think the cottages were so small? It was because the longest you get bamboo in is 12 to 14 feet. How are you going to get it to cover 40 feet? And I kept saying, wait, wait, wait. And they kept saying, no, 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 no. And finally one day I brought out a template and began to build bamboo trusses. And we used the bamboo trusses to make the span and put a roof on, and they'd never seen that happen before. At the end of that exercise, the natives went back to Barugo, tore it down, and rebuilt it. I came out feeling I was more developed than they were. Why? Because I had more than they did? I didn't have anything that they didn't have. And that's what I learned. Development is not a matter of how much you have. It's a matter of how much you can do with whatever you have. The more you can do with what resources you've got, the more developed you are. Or put another way, the less dependent you are on the resources you have. Because of your ability to create resources, the more developed you are. Standard of living is not a measure of development. It's a measure of growth. What's the appropriate measure of development? Quality of life. That's why quality of work life and quality of life, participation in these concepts have come to the foreground in the last 15 to 20 years as systemic thinking has emerged. Because when we start to look at organizations, an army, a government, a corporation, as an entity which has responsibility for facilitating and encouraging the development of its members and of the society of which it's a part, it must turn to matters of aesthetics, which is the essence of quality of life, rather than matters of economics, which are matters of standard of living and growth. It's no surprise that we hear so much today about training and development. What is also not a surprise, but a great disappointment, is that most of the people who are involved in it haven't the foggiest idea what development is and therefore aren't doing it. See, development is not a matter of earning, it's a matter of learning. To develop is to increase your ability and desire to satisfy your own needs and desires and those of others. To develop is to increase your ability and desire to satisfy your own needs and desires and those of others. The paradigm of development is not the paradigm of growth. John Pierpont Morgan, Jean-Paul Getty, Sam Walton may be paragons of growth, but not of development. The paragon of development is Robinson Crusoe, the ultimate symbol of the developed man. Why? He built a hell of a good quality of life out of nothing. Okay? It's not a matter of how much you've got, but how much you can do with whatever you have. We have begun to appreciate the fact that continued increase of standard of living is very frequently accompanied by decreasing quality of life. And that's what the ecology movement is all about. people saying we have to be willing to sacrifice some of our standard of living to get a higher quality of life. Well, I've gone on too long. I would welcome any argument, criticism, suggestions, or anything else any of you have. Please feel free to yell up. Go ahead.
The term metaphysics is used today in describing, I believe, new relationships between man and God. Is that the way you see it? To be the product?
It's another one of the words that terribly misused. It was originally used by Aristotle.
I did not hear the question.
The term metaphysics is used today to describe the relationship of man to God. And it's used in 50 different ways. There's trouble. It was originally used by Aristotle. It literally means after physics. It was a book he wrote after the book called Physics. And philosophers have been trying to put additional significance into it ever since. You know, and it has no more significance than number 2 did coming after number 1. What it is generally taken to mean is the study of the structure of the universe, which cannot be directly observed but inferred from what we observe. It's what is beyond observation but there. That's the most generally taken meaning. Now, if you happen to think that what's beyond observation is there contains God, then God becomes a part of metaphysics. But you don't have to be a theologian or a deist to be a metaphysician. There are atheistic metaphysicians. Yeah.
I'm not sure whether you would believe that the universe is infinite or it's finite. And if you believe that it is infinite, would you believe that from an expansionist theory that you could ever explain going out?
I said you can never prove either one. And therefore you don't have to believe either, and I don't. I don't feel any need to believe either that it's finite or infinite. It's irrelevant because it can't affect anything I do. So I just don't think about it. It was critical in the machine age, but it isn't now. It's a matter of faith. If you want to believe in an expanding universe, you can. I can't prove you're wrong. If you want to believe in a finite universe, you can. I can't prove you're wrong. It's a matter of emotional preference. But we don't have to pretend it's a scientific issue and argue about it, you know? Yeah.
You said earlier that an older version of the purpose of a corporation would be survival and growth. And now you said that the model
is development.
But wouldn't that also include survival along with that equally?
Survival and growth become means of development, just as profit became a means to survival and growth. They're no longer objectives. They are means. Let me just put it this way. In the current world of internationalizing of markets and production, competition has become more and more intense. Everybody's aware of that in our economy, and we're losing the war, as you know, the economic war. The only way a company can survive is to increase its productivity, which means to decrease the resources consumed in producing a given product or service. The most effective way we have of increasing productivity today is through automation. But that reduces the number of people required to do the work, right? Now, employment is the only method ever discovered by society of simultaneously producing and distributing wealth. Every other method of distributing wealth doesn't create it. So if we eliminated employment, we might have a perfect distribution, but what we'd be distributing would not be wealth because there wouldn't be any wealth to distribute. So employment is critical. How in the world can you increase productivity and increase employment at the same time? That has become the central problem of contemporary management of corporations, because most of them are contracting. It's because they're contracting that we have all these national economic problems. The answer is growth. If you grow in a coordinated way with increases in productivity, then you absorb the people who are displaced by new technology into new businesses which are created through growth. Okay? There are really fundamental changes occurring up there. For example, we are already on the way, Europe is there, Sweden and Germany are, where employment is fixed by law. You can't fire people. Now, for 100 years in American corporations, essential to our understanding has been a distinction between fixed and variable costs. A fixed cost is the cost of the building. The building is there. You can't pick it up and move it. The equipment is a fixed cost. People are a variable cost because you can hire and fire them. But now, all of a sudden, you can't fire them anymore. And labor becomes a fixed cost, and people discover that a building is a variable cost because you don't have to own it. You can lease it. And if you do, it becomes an expense and you don't treat it as investment. These concepts of fixed and variable turn out to be completely relative. But now you've got to run the business to maximize the return on labor, not the return on capital. Let me tell you, that really does change the way a corporation is run. It completely transforms it. Now, those transformations are only beginning to occur, but they're going to occur in the military. Because sooner or later, somebody's going to say that the principal function of the military is to contribute to the development of its members and of the society of which it's a part. And defense will be interpreted as a means to that end. And that's going to produce very fundamental changes in thought. Okay? Yeah.
You had stated before that Singer had proven that choice becomes an objectively observable behavior, and that led to behaviors and sciences. Skinner seems to be an anomaly in that.
That's right. Skinner had never proceeded beyond about 1910. I mean, no, he's still alive. His thinking has never proceeded beyond 1910. I mean, there's still people who believe in Newton. I just the other day attended a meeting with somebody who denied Einstein. That goes on. Skinner is a mechanist. He's a mechanistic behaviorist, and he represents 2 generations ago in psychology. He happens to be a very smart man, but he's wrong. Yeah.
Since a lot of your discussion was centered around the sort of religious kind of concepts, how do you view the resurgence recently of the so-called fundamentalist groups?
Well, I guess I really ought to be honest with you. I'm not interested in that question, so I can't give you a good answer to it. I could fabricate one, but that would be unfair to you. It's just one I don't think worth thinking about. So that doesn't mean it isn't worth others thinking about. That's not where I'm concerned. Take one more. Yeah.
For a year back, nothing to do with Congress has been fired by the corporation.
Can you come up? I can't hear what you're saying. I'm sorry.
About a year back, the Apple computer founder has been fired by the corporation, and then still now is doing extremely well, the Apple computers. And how do you interpret your management style with respect to this, the founder who brought up the company after 10 years, it became one of the 500
See,
companies. Still he has been fired. And is it due to he was controlling the growth, or the corporation was going out of control of the corporation?
you're asking me to explain a phenomena of Apple computer using cause and effect. But I've just rejected cause and effect. And therefore, I can't blame it on either Steve or the success on Scully. Now, they may have been necessary, but neither one is sufficient either for the failure or the success. You see, when you think synthetically, you don't talk about blame and what's the cause. What you look for are the interactions which produce a given state. Scully in Pepsi-Cola was not the success he is in Apple. Okay? He didn't do it alone at Apple. A lot of other conditions were there that made him succeed. Steve was very successful at Apple up to a certain point, and then he failed. So it's the interaction of various conditions, and you can't give a simple explanation of a systemic property. Okay? Thank you.
This thing still on? I promised you a unique experience there, and I think you'll agree that Dr. Ackoff's way of viewing the world, management, and a number of other things is indeed unique. It was a learning experience for me after 4 times already hearing him. It's been different from all the other times, even though he told me it would be the same. I heard things I hadn't heard before, and you said them in less time, so I don't know how you did that. But I'd like to thank you very much on behalf of all the organizations who sponsor this, and on behalf of all of us here who were privileged to hear you today, sir. Thank you very much.